serves Executive Director of Just Peace Advocates. She is also founder of Palestine Peace Trade. Karen has served as a human rights volunteer observer in Palestine for the World Council of Churches, and Just Peace Advocates, and BDS Coalition, right? And Palestine Just Trade. All right, so Karen is going to be talking to us today about BDS and then the divestment movement. And Karen has asked me to also speak up a little bit about the divestment coalition happening right now in Queens. As I mentioned earlier, there's an encampment that has been launched as of yesterday at Queens University. Woo! Yeah, that's okay. Cool. So as of yesterday, as of last night, there's an encampment, and right now, people on the ground are asking for community support right after this session, because there will be a rally around 4 p.m. or 4:30, and this will go on, especially because Monday, the Palestinian movement has actually called for an encampment day of action. So they're asking everyone to go out, support, and also even go on strike and essentially miss work to support the encampments happening all over Ontario as well as all over Canada. And yeah, so with this divestment movement that's happening all across Canada and America, students have taken it on themselves to create encampments until university administrations decide to divest from Israeli companies. And it's actually insane the amount of numbers that all these universities have invested in companies that are related to Israel in some way or another. Some very direct, like weapons manufacturing companies, while others are more like tech companies, and as well as banks. For example, Queens has investments in Israeli bank. They have investments in Lockheed Martin, in Elbit Systems, which is the Israeli weapons manufacturer. And again, so this is like millions and millions of dollars, which institutions who claim that they're, for education, for academic success, and for well-being, for students' well-being, and the EDI and their policies of ethical investment. Again, we're seeing the opposite of that happening. And so, with this movement, and we're seeing it after many years after students around the world are also advocating for divestment from apartheid South Africa. And Queens did divest in 1987 from South African apartheid, and we're trying to do this again. That took about 10 years, but as Dr. Khan was saying, if we don't have that time, we don't have 10 more years to wait for more Palestinians to be killed and maimed. So please support the encampment, support the community. We will be here. We'll be there for the next. We'll see how long, depending on capacity and what happens. But we can't do that. We can't keep going without the support and without numbers. With numbers, there is so much power. So thank you. I think I talked too much, and I'm going.
Thank you very much, and very much to get out as a community and support those at Queens, the students and the faculty. I'm sure some of you are following the news and saw the riot police going at the University of Calgary, and I think also in Edmonton. So there are calls to support statements and such about that. Also, like the injunction is happening again, the second one for McGill in Montreal. So. And here in Ontario, my understanding is there's legislation changes happening with the University and Colleges Act that might try to shut down the camps through that way, with a focus particularly on UMT, but sort of like all of the campuses. So can't stress enough the importance of the community in this moment, standing with the students. So I'm very pleased to join you. I was very fortunate to be well mentored by some very wonderful people across occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem and Palestinians here in Canada. So I got very much as a settler. I think my sixth great grandfather was the founder of Peterborough in terms of the settlers. So my roots of settlement go back really to right as the treaties were formed here in 1812. So I bring that and recognize that as I come to you here in Kingston. Justice Advocates, our not-for-profit, was formed in 2018 with Jonathan Katab, who's one of the founders of the human rights organization in Ramallah. Was at Osgood Law School, and the attempt was to do some work to get research and legal expertise and other work-related campaigns together at that time. For the kinds of things that Ben was talking to you over lunch about. And we, often those attacks are very complicit. You don't even know it's about Palestine too. So some are very public. Sometimes they're such that you might feel it, but not even actually know it. So some of those resources were put in place, and we had about a dozen lawyers ready to go just as March 2020 happened and COVID happened to go on a study trip. And bring back some work at that time. And so that didn't happen, but certainly there's strong support from different groups across Canada related to legal work now, and that's so important. So that's sort of our context, and we are one of the 20 or so members, a little more than 20 members of the Canadian BDS Coalition. So I'm really thrilled when the reach out came to the Canadian BDS Coalition for someone to join. And I'm sure some of our comrades from, okay, it's going back away, okay, from Montreal or Toronto would have been there, except maybe I could just yell. So that's turned off. So do I need to put that on, or just hold it? Maybe that's not on, I don't think.
It's on handheld. We can get a little further
back. To hold the handheld a little further. Yeah, is that a between them? Which do I need to use? Which is better?
Use the handheld one. I'll turn it down. Just hold it in a spot. And just talk.
All I felt like two are away. Is that seem okay? I still
Can't hear you at all now.
Turned off at the mic. Yeah, great. I'll leave it to the technical people. There we go. Okay, that's a bit better. Yeah, I'm sure some of our comrades and friends from Montreal and Toronto would have joined, except of course it is NAPCA Day, so people are out on the street across the city. So I'm honored to be here. I'll share a little bit about the BDS movement in particular related to the grassroots movement across Canada and Quebec, just to provide a bit of history and context and some of the resources. But in particular, we're going to take some time for you to also have some input and talk about where you can take on the challenge. And I think again, Ben put very clearly, which is we can't afford to be silent and complicit in our silence right now. So in this moment, what can you personally do and how can you organize? And I know there's a list that will be going around from the organizers around people who may be interested in organizing relating to BDS as well. So think about that. So let me maybe start first with a quote, and I'm just going to ask you when you think this might have happened. So the quote is, could the Premier tell this House, and it was in Ontario, I'll tell you, it was in the Ontario legislature. So could the Premier tell this House whether he intends to bring forward legislation, not by a private member, but as the government, to take tough measures that he has promised would be taken in the event that federal measures were insufficient to deal with the anti-Israel boycott? Any idea what year, what context that quote was? It is?
1980s.
Yeah, a little earlier, but yeah. Some people might have said 2016 when the anti-BDS motion went in, but it was actually, some of you have to be older and have lived in Ontario maybe a while, like myself, but that was 1977 under the Conservative Premier Bill Davis or William Davis. So this is sort of not a new conversation even in our legislatures. If you go into the Hansard, you'll see those debates from the 70s, which you know, sort of led up to some of the things that we just had heard from the as well around what was happening on the ground in Palestine as well. But you know, in 2005, and that's when many of us think about the grassroots BDS movement happening, it was a year after the International Court of Justice had made the ruling related to the separation wall or the apartheid wall being illegal. And Palestinian civil society came together at that time with what is known as the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, which you might be surprised to know that among those initial signatories, I think there were 170, and go to the website, bdsmovement.net, and you'll see that some of those were Canadian groups, actually about a half a dozen were Canadian groups, so not all really were Palestinian, but they were Palestinians from the groups that you've described, actually, you know, because you had diaspora population and solidarity folks joining. And it was really from that movement that across Canada, a lot of important things happened through those first couple of years. One was the founding of the Israeli Apartheid Week, which first happened in Toronto and spread across the world. And that came out of the Canadian Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid, or CAIA group at that time, with SIA groups or student groups across campuses across the country. And also Labour for Palestine, and you're seeing much of the work of Labour for Palestine again more recently, but very active at that time, along with that time, the Faculty for Palestine. And from that work with the Labour for Palestine, I think a couple of really important things happened at that time. And it was even 2006, so just a year after the BDS call from the grassroots in Palestine, that the Canadian Union of Public Employees in Ontario passed the BDS movement, and a couple of years later, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers in 2008. So there was a lot of important work, but at the same point, sometimes that work does get set aside, right? Because it's in that moment that the work happens, but it's important to get moving forward. Now, in terms of BDS, we think about the tactics of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. But I think it's important just first to start to say that really the three calls of BDS are to end the occupation, which is the occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. Number two, to end apartheid in historic Palestine. And I think the initial call was more in 48, but we really realized that apartheid is, you know, from the river to the sea. And the third is the realization of the right of return that was afforded to Palestinians under the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 1994 back in 47. So it was in 2016, there wasn't as much action sort of happening, you know, coming out of the attack on Gaza in 2014. A lot of student groups had mobilized. There were a lot of BDS motions that were passed at that time, but there was a very concerted effort by the pro-Israel movement to really shut a lot of that down. And some of that was through universities, Canada, the 97 presidents and colleges of universities across Canada, that organization, where basically they were asked by the pro-Israel lobby to include in the student handbooks that the country of origin was to have human rights. So basically taking the human rights code and using the language as if it's an individual from a country, but saying the country should have rights, the country of Israel. So universities, Canada denied that they actually agreed to that, but then university presidents began some of that work to start to change the handbooks. And at the same time, things started to happen on campus, including some of that getting into initially at Ryerson, which is now Toronto Metropolitan University, that kind of learning actually given into the students' own efforts, and that was even with a very pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, quite progressive slate of students, but who were a little scared of the Israeli lobby at the time. And if you go on and look at the IHRA definition and that work, Ryerson or Toronto Metropolitan will be shown as one of the first ones to sort of pass that motion at the time to support IHRA, although it wasn't called that at the time, it was still being called really the Ottawa Protocol, which was really something that about 7-10 years earlier through Irving Cotler and the Canadian government. So all these pieces, it's a lot of history, but sort of show this effort to really quiet and shut things down. So in 2016, the Canadian government, Trudeau came into power, I guess, the fall of 2015. 2016, January, February, the motion was passed against an anti-BDS motion. And so with that, about 20, 25 groups across Canada came together and said, we need to do more work together. There have been work around more anti-occupation kinds of boycotts, things that were related to settlements, but the idea was to really do the whole boycott work and do it together. So with that, groups from Newfoundland, Vancouver Island came together and basically just started developing campaigns and supporting each other's campaigns. The first partial victory was in November 2017, so next year, and that was when Air Canada confirmed that it ended a contract that it had with Israeli aerospace industries. And it was 2 years into a 5-year contract. So that was pretty significant. We called it a partial victory because Air Canada still sold hummus and some other stuff, so they weren't totally apartheid free. But it did sort of say that, by working together and working with groups doing BDS around the world, because we actually reached out to, other countries where Air Canada comes into their airports and other things, and just started sort of working with labor, that sometimes changes can be made. The government of Israel did notice, and the next year the strategic ministry came up with their first list of those groups that they were concerned about that were very pro-BDS. That was in 2018, and the Canadian BDS Coalition was the only Canadian group on that list. So we saw that as maybe a victory, that we were being noticed for our work. And we were mapped to other groups, including Al-Haq and Defense for Children International, Palestine, and other groups like that. So we, again, thought we might be a pretty good company. So basically, the groups that came together from the coalition really had to, agree to a basis of unity, and they had to agree to the basis of unity of the call to end occupation and apartheid and the right of return. And that meant some groups did not join the coalition because they really would only go so far as anti-occupation. They would not say the word apartheid. They didn't necessarily even support necessarily the whole right of return. So some of those groups, you would find common ground to work with them, but they didn't join the coalition. That would remain. The coalition over the last few years has started to sort of evolve its basis of unity and put other statements in, including that we recognize that Zionism is a supreme ideology that was created by the settler colonial state in historic Palestine, and that we support a secular democratic state of Palestine in historic land of Palestine with equality before the law of all citizens, regardless of religion, ethnicity, and gender. So we basically then also declared that we are anti-Zionist, which we probably always were, but again, that takes some of the groups that are in the movement in Canada who haven't been able to make that declaration, so I would have been part of the coalition. But again, doesn't mean that we wouldn't look for common ground to work with those other groups in areas such as IHRA or stopping IHRA or other things like that. Most recently, the coalition's in the process of changing its name to the Canadian BDS Coalition and International BDS Allies, because other international groups have asked to join it as well. So we would welcome groups from Kingston or other places. There is a group called Ontario Palestinian Rights, which came out of Oakville originally, but is so virtual during COVID that they would welcome individuals that might be in a rural area or an area where there are even a couple people to form a group and might want to be part of a pretty dynamic group. So there are some options. I'd be glad to talk to you about those. So maybe just now I will turn to what are boycotts, what are divestments, and what are sanctions, just to make sure we have some clear ground a little bit there. We usually think of boycotts because that seems to be the sort of most accessible particular understanding. So you could think of consumer items, you could think of companies, you could think of cultural boycotts, you could think of anything that's related to brand Israel or promotion, artists, in that regard, academic institutions. And so it's sort of endless the things you could think of that could fit in with that. For the idea of BDS, I mean, the idea is sometimes a very targeted campaign, so you can show that you're making a difference. So some campaigns are pretty high profile, like, I don't know, Hewlett Packard or any of the Booking.com and Airbnbs or Israeli dates, you know, and Israeli produce. So those kinds of things are, but also it is a matter of people being able to make conscious choices as well. So knowing what other items are actually contributing to Israel, and that's really been the grassroots movement that's come out of the current context since October in particular. So in that sense, the Canadian BDS Coalition welcomes suggestions people have and tries to develop small campaigns and information that can be shared on social media and other things just to help people know. So I don't know if you're going out to buy your new picnic table and chairs, you know not to buy counter plastic because they're from the settlements, and you check when you get your swimming pool cleaning equipment that it too isn't from Israel or whatever. So those kinds of campaigns, if you've got items as individuals, that kind of thing, you can contact the coalition from the website at bdscoalition.ca and share those. Also, the Canadian BDS Coalition isn't quick to necessarily declare a victory, as I mentioned in Canada, and the same would be with Puma. Some of you might have heard that Puma, there's a bit of a victory before Christmas. Well, it was quite opportune, right? Because it was just when Christmas shopping was happening, and that was kind of old news, although they made it public that they weren't renewing that contract. So they weren't renewing the contract with the Israeli Football Association. But they still have a part-time contract with Maccabi and other things happening. So we said, don't start buying Puma just because they said they weren't renewing the contract in the future. That happened to happen just as their sales were plummeting as genocide happened in Gaza, right? So I think it is important to be careful as you think about what is a victory. And maybe I'll talk about that a little bit in regard to divestments fairly quickly. You guys have done well at Queen's if you know what Queen's is invested in, because most universities or pensions or other institutions don't actually disclose what their portfolios are, and that's been a big challenge with universities as they've had the encampments. The first point is disclosure of the full portfolio, because they've got things in them, but you may not be able to get that proof, right? There are pensions where there is proof. Our Canada pension plan, which most of us will be contributors to or recipients from, does have to publish their information every year. So in that regard, the last 5 years, my organization has done an assessment, of the Canada pension plan, and for the last 3 years, the Quebec pension plan, so we know what is in those plans. And more recently, the large public service pension plans, so if folks are a healthcare worker and part of the HOOPS plan, or you're a municipal worker and part of OWERS, or a federal civil servant and part of the PSP, or if you're a government Ontario employee and part of ILCO, or happen to be BC or Alberta where they have larger public service plans, we know what those investments are because they're so large that they have to register with the US Security Exchange Commission. So we can get those portfolios. The folks that do environment divestment around fossil fuels are really good at that. We work kind of in coalition with these kinds of things. So with all of that, those pensions are $25 billion. We put them together, invested in just the Israeli war crimes. I mean, we're not really taking it to broader apartheid. We're not taking it to broader. It does include military, but it may not include all the military because it's really based on a few things that you can do to look at what's included in those portfolios. So what we do, and it may be helpful to some of you if you're trying to do some of your work on pension plans or universities or other places, is we start with the United Nations database. So the United Nations in 2020 came out with a list of companies that it deemed as, they don't use as strong language as I do, but really in violation of the Geneva Convention of International Humanitarian Law, and basically therefore war crimes, really basically war crimes. So they came out with 112 companies in 2020, or yeah, 2020. 2018, let me be accurate, 2018. And then in 2020, a number of the companies had gone to the UN and said, "But we cleaned up our shop, we really should be on that list." So the list was brought back to 97 companies in 2020. There's currently a call that's just kind of last week to put submissions in to add more companies back to the list, and that submission's due in early June. So if you've got companies you want to add it to the list, see me and I'm glad to help facilitate that. So we look at those 97 companies because that's, you know, pretty solid. The UN has already said they're problem. Then we go to our friends, the Quakers in the US, the American Friends Service Committee, and they have a wonderful tool called AFSC, American Friends Service Committee Investigate. And if you just put that into your web browser, it gives you a tool that has a broader list of companies that you can look at by taking your pension plan. If you know, hold a card, get the actual portfolio and run it through, and or the university's portfolio or whatever, and actually evaluate what's in them so you can look at the list. And it also can include prisons and borders and other things, but if you want to focus just on Palestine, occupation, then occupation of Palestine can do that, and that's what we do when we look at pension plans to come up with a $25 billion complicity with the pension funds we know about. We also this year have looked at the list that's on the World Beyond War list, which if you go onto World Beyond War Canada, the Canada site, and just put in Canada, Stop Arming Israel, the list of all the companies that where actions are happening around the arms embargo and trying to get getting an arms embargo for two-way arms trade are there. So we also manually go through and add those. So if Honeywell is on the UN list from the Quaker group in the US, then we still add it. Another wonderful resource to look at this kind of information is whoprofits.org. And if you want whoprofits.org, it's an Israeli research group that really pulls up the research on all of this. WSP, which is a company in Montreal, an engineering company. I'm sure they have an office here in Kingston. They're very involved in the complicity of building the light rail in Jerusalem. In fact, they are the project manager. Somehow they and Bombardier did not get on the list in 2018, although or 20, but the list had been leaked about 2 years before to say there would be 2 Canadian companies that would be on the list. And the thought would have been that they were probably those companies. So a submission was made to the UN by Al-Haq and Justice Advocates to have them added to the list, and we'll be working more on that as we go. And they are a big part of the investment for Canada Pension Plan and the Quebec Pension Plan. So I think it is important because you've got to have the passion of what you're doing and out there, but you also have to be ready to have the research and the information that will support it as you go forward, and to hold the follow through as well. In that regard, maybe I'll just mention the United Church of Canada divestment. So after about 10 years, in 2015, the United Church of Canada, during their general meeting, came up with a solid divestment resolution related to Palestine. I think there was one on fossil fuels and maybe on mining before that. However, they never disclosed the pension. So here we are 10 years later, never disclosed the pension. None of the other funds of the church, the larger church have, nor have any small congregations. So if any of you were members of local unit churches, even symbolically, don't have any investments, you could maybe still, so you wouldn't make any investments. But here we are 10 years later. So at the time, there was, like media, the pro-Israel folks were a bit critical because the UNI Church said they would divest, but in actual fact, they hadn't. And the pro-Israel community, the pro-Israel community was aware of that. I remember flipping through the radio stations at the time and coming across a fairly right-wing radio station. It was interviewing somebody probably from CIJA or one of the pro-Israel groups who said, we're not too worried, we know that the United Church probably won't be a problem, right? So sometimes I say that in caution, even as we're in this passion right now, for universities like Thompson, who said they're going to disclose and divest here in Canada. I mean, the follow through is so right, because you get the in time and then the follow through isn't there. So not to take away from that, because saying it is important, but it's still important to carry on. Sanctions, I won't spend any time on, just to say that ultimately, of course, is so important, as we know from South Africa. and certainly pretty hard to do in the context of our double standards here in Canada. You know, it doesn't take long for Russian wine to be taken off, or liquor to be taken off the shelves. Meanwhile, even a fairly minor court win around labeling of Israeli settlement product saw that product continue to flow through the LCBO and all the other liquor agencies across Canada. At the same time, I know personally, because I brought the first import of Thai wine and beer at that time. It was on the same ship with the settlement products that came over. It had been labeled and approved to be labeled by Canadian Food Inspection Agency and the LCBO. Product was started in March of 2019. Dimitri Laskiris and the court came down when Canada was deciding to appeal their court around case around labeling of settlement wine. The settlement wine was never held up, but the Thai-made product was kept in hostage, luckily in coolers at the LCBO. Well, they took 7 months to decide they did stickers put on it to say product but less thick, right? So, you know, that double standard does just kind of speak for itself on every level. The good thing about Palestinian beer, and wine gets better with age probably anyway, but with beer is it's really well bottled and it was still pretty good when it got 7 months later, and that's before they hadn't happened. So, and it got bought quickly, so that was good. So, I mean, in particular with the sanctions, I mean, we are starting to point out that complicity, and in particular, a couple of legal groups, but in particular the International Center for Justice in Palestine, Canada, which is working with the group in the UK, had provided the government of Canada back in November with a notice of intent to seek prosecution of Canadian officials who are allegedly complicit in Israel's war crimes. And the organization also, and this is the important part more for the BDS part, is considering expanding the scope of that initiative to pursue the accountability of Canadian companies who are allegedly complicit with Israel's war crimes. So, like our Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court applies to both the actors that are state actors, so governments, as well as to private individuals. So we are putting that kind of language out to make it clear that it is an offense to aid, abet, and otherwise assist in the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now that's easier said than done for sure, and because of the role the Attorney General plays in all of this, it makes it very, very, very difficult. But there are different tactics. So many of you are interested in work and research, for example, related to charities. We've done a lot of work through access requests where we have tracked the charities and where the money is going and who's funding those charities as well. And there's more and more of that will be coming out. And it is making some difference because we can see the CRA went back to some of the charities that complaints were put in with last year. Charities who had never indicated where the money was going to in Israel, even though they're supposed to under the Income Tax Act. But in actual fact, then when they filed a couple months later, they had listed all the entities that received the money, and that helped us to realize they were who we thought they were. Some of them already knew through other means, but it confirmed the support of right-wing settler groups, Israeli military, money going towards the Israeli military, and even organizations, other organizations were stopping aid from going to Gaza in the last few weeks. So that kind of work is, important both for transparency and does seem to play, some role as well. So I really am honored to be able to be here. I mean, it is a moment of energy and creativity and certainly the commitment. And I think in choosing what things one works on, it really is a matter of what things really motivate you and bring passion that you can bring, how you can work in small groups. What we found with the Canadian BDS Coalition is just having that energy of having between 30 or 40 groups that can meet once a month for a couple of hours virtually for the last 8 years, is that we see somebody who's doing something like getting bus ads on the buses in St. John's, Newfoundland, or raising a flag in St. John's, New Brunswick, or singing Christmas carols or holiday carols at the liquor stores in BC about apartheid fear or whatever wine, right? Those kinds of things people can share and echo. And certainly with the divestment movement, it's just incredible to see what is happening. So I would be open to questions or other resources that we could look at. I might mention, if people haven't already, certainly go on to the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association and find the report on anti-Palestinian racism. That is a really important report to be using. I was on a call with the Special Rapporteur for the United Nations for the Occupied Territories the other day, and she was giving wonderful accolades to Danny and her team for that document. Do go on to bdscoalition.ca and see the campaigns and the resources, justpeaceadvocates.ca, and then other things like I mentioned, like whoprofits.org, are important resources that I think are useful to look at. If you have a chance to get to the Toronto Palestinian Film Festival, if you haven't, your Strong Pass, that's another great way to either virtually, when you're hybrid now, or in person, learn more and more. If you haven't had a chance, many of you I know will have done lots of work on Palestine over the years, but depending on your entry point, those can be very important to the perspectives. So I think what could be useful is if people did, or to the organizers, but just spend 5 or 7 minutes sort of turning to a couple of people around you to just talk about what you've heard for today. If you've got any questions that you want answered or anything that you're kind of committed to actually saying out loud that you want to work on and do yourselves. And then we'll come back to the wrap up where people up to sort of like this 5 minutes, just turning in groups of, I don't know, 3 or 5 or 2 or whatever's handy, just it will bring you back in about 5-7 minutes to wrap up.
I hope you were all able to speak a little bit about BDS amongst yourselves. And